January 1945. A shattered village near the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. American guns opened fire without warning, and the sky tore open. A shell screamed down, the ground heaved, and a wall of flame and lime dust swallowed the street. And a 23-year-old German radio operator named Marguerite Hoffmann was hurled forward as a jagged piece of white-hot steel punched through her back and stopped an inch from her spine. She did not scream. She did not fall. She pressed a shaking hand to her smoking uniform and ran. That shard of German metal would travel with her across a ruined country, across an ocean, into a prison camp baking in the Texas sun. For 4 months, it would try to kill her. And the only person who could save her life was the one man she had been raised to fear above all others, an American soldier. If you love true World War II stories told like a movie, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Stay with me because this one will stay with you long after it ends. Her name was Marguerite Hoffmann, a chemist's daughter, a nobody. And the secret buried under her skin would shatter everything two enemies believed about each other. Early 1945. The Third Reich was dying. Town after town shook under artillery. The roads west were choked with broken soldiers and terrified civilians, all fleeing a front the shells kept chasing. Germany was losing, and everyone in that signals unit knew it, even if none dared say it aloud. Marguerite was not a fighter. She handled radio messages, tapped out codes, passed orders down the line. Her work was supposed to be safe behind the fighting. That was the lie. But when the American barrage came, there was no behind the lines anymore. The fragment came from an 88mm shell lodging deep near her ribs, wrapped in torn muscle and burned cloth. At first, she told herself it was only a bruise. Only at night, lying still, did the truth arrive. It burned. A coal trapped beneath the skin. And here was the horror of it: she could not go for help. The German field hospitals in those final months were places of nightmare. One nurse later wrote they sometimes had a single doctor for hundreds of wounded, that they cut away cloth with dirty scissors and simply prayed. Medicine had run out. Infections spread through the wards like fire through dry grass, and the badly hurt were carried away and never seen again. Margaret had heard those stories. She had heard the screaming from the tents at night, and she made a decision that would sound insane to anyone who had not lived it. She hid the wound. As her unit fell back toward the Rhine, she kept her right arm pressed tight against her body. Every jolt sent fire down her side. When comrades asked if she was wounded, she looked them in the eye and said no. She would rather carry enemy steel than lie on a German operating table with no morphine and no hope. She trusted the shell inside her more than her own army's surgeons. Then in March, the Americans arrived. Tanks clanked through the streets while Marguerite and 6 other women crouched in a farmhouse cellar, certain they would die. Every leaflet, every whispered warning had said the same thing. The Americans shoot prisoners like dogs. Surrender means death. So when the soldiers came down the cellar steps, the women raised their hands and waited for the guns. The guns never came. One American held out a canteen of water. Another asked in clumsy German whether anyone was hurt. And Marguerite, staring at the enemy she had been taught to fear, shook her head and said she was fine. She believed the propaganda more than the man in front of her, certain that if she admitted the wound, she would be taken away and vanish, just like the wounded back home. But everything was about to change, because of a man she had not yet met, an American who would refuse to accept her quiet, desperate lie. His name was Thomas Reed. Corporal, 26 years old, the son of a Chicago pharmacist. He was not a hero and not supposed to be anywhere near this story. Reed had trained for combat, learned to fire a rifle, learned to crawl under machine gun fire toward an enemy he had never met. He wanted to fight. Then, a training accident shattered his leg, and a steel rod took the place of the bone. The Army looked at a man who could no longer run and sent him to the last place he imagined, Camp Swift, Texas, to push paper in a medical office. His days were forms and numbers, height, weight, scars. He processed German prisoners bound for road crews and cotton fields, and the irony gnawed at him. He had prepared to kill Germans with a rifle. Now he handed them soap and recorded blood pressure. Camp Swift sat on flat red land 20 miles east of Austin. Rows of white barracks under a hard blue sky, the summer heat pressing down like a hand. By mid-1945, Texas alone held around 80,000 German prisoners across more than 70 camps, and Camp Swift could pack in more than 10,000 men at once. What surprised the prisoners most was the mercy. 3 hot meals a day, real mattresses. One German later admitted they ate better in that camp than in their last winter at home. It was supposed to be a place of savages, and instead, bacon fat drifted from the kitchens each morning. Reed was a careful man, the kind who read people the way his father read a prescription. And that was why one hot May afternoon, a single prisoner caught his eye and would not let go. 2 trucks rolled up carrying 15 German women in faded gray uniforms. Women prisoners were rare, and word raced through the camp. They climbed down into the dust, stood straight, faces closed. But one of them, slim hair tied back, moved wrong. She held her right arm clamped against her side, and even in the punishing heat when the truck jolted, she seemed to shiver. Reed did not know her name yet. But the way she guarded that shoulder told him a story the paperwork would never mention. And then came the day he was ordered to examine her. The exam room was a converted barracks. Bare floorboards, a metal table, a slow fan pushing hot air in circles. The women came in one at a time, and Reed worked fast. Names, ages, lungs, backs. Marguerite was 7th in line. When he asked if she had any illness, any wound, any pain, she paused a heartbeat too long, then shook her head. "No, I am well." He had seen prisoners fake sickness to dodge work. This was the opposite. This woman was hiding something and hiding it hard. He asked her to remove her jacket. She did it with her left hand, only the right arm hanging stiff. He asked her to raise both arms. The left went up easily. The right lifted a few inches. Then she gasped. Her face went white, her jaw locked against a scream. Reed reached out and laid 2 fingers gently on the back of her shoulder through the thin cloth of her shirt. She flinched as if he had branded her. And the heat, that was what he would never forget. It came through the fabric, real heat, hotter than the room, hotter than the Texas afternoon. Something under that skin was burning. "You are hurt," he said softly. "It is nothing," she whispered. "It will pass." But it would not pass, and Reed knew it. Here was the crazy part. This woman had carried shrapnel next to her bones since January. 4 months while her body fought a losing war against infection with no medicine, no surgery, nothing but silence and prayer. An untreated deep wound like that does not simply heal. It festers. It poisons the blood. It reaches the bone and rots it. A U.S. Army medical report from 1944 warned that untreated deep wounds could kill more men than bullets did on the day of battle. Every day she stayed quiet. She moved closer to a slow, screaming death. And she was choosing it, ready to die, rather than let a surgeon touch her. To Reed, trained in an army swimming in penicillin and clean instruments, it was madness. To Marguerite, it was cold logic built from everything she had witnessed. "Better to die quietly among people you know," she told another woman, than on a table among strangers. A German prisoner who spoke good English tried to explain. "You must understand, Corporal. We were told your kindness is the first trick. If we accept it, we begin to doubt everything." He could have signed the form and moved on. Instead, he made a decision that put his own standing on the line. He would save a woman who did not want to be saved. He just had no idea how to break through a wall that years of propaganda had built. He started with the truth. "I can't help you," he told her, "unless you tell me the truth." For 3 days, she gave one answer. No hospital, no operation. Then an older prisoner named Gertrude, a translator before the war, found him. "She is afraid you will hurt her," she said. "Not because you are cruel, but because you do not know her. She has seen men cut open with almost no morphine. She thinks it better to let the wound decide than the surgeon. Words are easy. She will need more." And that gave Reed his idea. The next morning, he signed out the key to the dispensary. He brought Marguerite to the small, cool supply room, a guard at the door, and opened the cabinet. He did not argue. He did not lecture. He simply showed her. Rows of clear glass ampoules filled with morphine, white tins of sulfa powder, sterile bandages, stainless steel instruments wrapped in clean cloth. He put a bottle into her hand and let her feel its weight, let her read the English label with her own eyes. "This is what we use," he said. "Not a frontline tent. This is Texas. We have enough here." And this was the moment everything turned. Marguerite had been told prisoners would be starved and beaten and left to rot. Now she held more medicine in one hand than an entire German unit had seen in months. By 1945, the United States was producing hundreds of millions of units of penicillin every month. What she held was not a slogan. It was cold, undeniable proof heavy in her palm. "You promise," she whispered at last. "You promise I will not wake up in screaming pain." "I promise," Reed answered. "We will make you sleep. We will take the metal out. Then you can heal." She looked at the cabinet, then at him. And something in her eyes shifted less like a wall, now more like a door pushed slightly open. "I will sign," she said. That afternoon, Reed filled the papers to bring a surgeon from Fort Sam Houston and transfer her to the base hospital. Approval crawled through the system while the infection raced ahead. Within days, the answer came back. Yes. The army truck rattled north through the dust. Marguerite on the bench, with her arm in a makeshift sling, Reed beside her, the fear heavier than the pain in her back. The base hospital stunned her. Cool air, polished floors, nurses in white moving fast and quiet. By 1945, the U.S. Army had built a medical system with more than 300,000 beds around the world, supplied with blood penicillin and sulfa drugs, on a scale the dying German army could only dream of. The surgeon was a tall man named Pritchard Gray at the Temples, who had operated through North Africa and Italy. He ran his fingers over the scar, found the hard point buried underneath, and let out a low whistle. "Since January," Reed told him. 4 months. Pritchard shook his head. "A wonder she's still walking." She signed the consent with her left hand and lay awake that night thinking of the filthy field stations back home, the men biting leather straps. Here the tools were wrapped and sterile. The enemy she had been taught to fear was about to try to save her life. In the early morning they wheeled her under the lights. A mask came down. Breathe deep. A sharp, sweet smell of anesthetic, and the ceiling dissolved. The surgery took nearly 3 hours. The fragment was wedged between her shoulder blade and third rib, locked in scar tissue and pockets of infection. Pritchard cut carefully, cleared the dead flesh, washed the wound again and again, packed it with sulfa powder. Another month, he said afterward, and it would have reached the bone. When he came out in his green gown, he held up a small glass vial. Inside, floating in clear fluid, lay a twisted chip of dark metal the size of a fingernail. "German 88, he said. "Quite a traveler." Reed took the vial. It felt heavier than it looked. That tiny shard had crossed a village, a country and ocean, and now sat trapped in 3 inches of glass. When Marguerite woke, the burning was gone. "They let me hold it," she told Reed later, her voice soft with morphine. 4 months it tried to kill me, and now it sits in a bottle. An older German prisoner in the next bed watched Reed bring her books and roadside flowers. "He is kind to you," he murmured. "He is a medic," she answered. "He sees a patient, not a prisoner. What did we become?" The old man whispered that such simple kindness can surprise us. The metal was out, the infection was beaten, and a German woman was learning that everything she had been told about the enemy was a lie. But her story was far from over, because the war was ending. Germany would surrender in May, and soon the fields of Texas would call every prisoner into the blazing heat for a harvest none expected. Marguerite would bend her healing shoulder over American soil. Reed would receive orders that tore them apart, and a single glass vial, a chip of enemy steel, would begin a journey across the ocean neither could imagine. What happens when the enemy who saved your life must let you go? In Part 2, the harvest begins. The goodbyes arrive, and a chip of metal in a glass vial becomes the most important thing either of them will ever own. Camp Swift, Texas. The summer of 1945. A German prisoner named Marguerite Hoffman had carried a shell fragment in her shoulder for 4 months, hiding it, certain that surgery meant death. An American medic, Corporal Thomas Reed, refused to accept her silence. He showed her a cabinet full of medicine won her trust, and a surgeon pulled the twisted chip of German steel out of her back. The metal now sat sealed in a glass vial. She was going to live, but cutting the metal out had been the easy part, because the war was ending and a different danger was closing in. Not shrapnel this time. Regulations. Suspicion. The cold machinery of an army that had just seen exactly what the enemy was capable of. In April 1945, American troops had thrown open the gates of Buchenwald and Dachau, and the photographs had traveled home. Overnight kindness toward a German prisoner looked like weakness, or worse, like betrayal. Reed had saved one life. Now he was about to learn how many people wanted him to stop, and this is where everything got harder. The trouble began with a clipboard and a closed door. Captain Vernon Doyle ran the administrative side of Camp Swift strictly by the book. He had never fired a shot in anger, had spent the entire war behind a desk in Texas, and he guarded the regulations the way other men guarded a hill under fire. The rule book was the only weapon he would ever carry, and he intended to use every page of it. He had been watching Corporal Reed for weeks now. He had noticed the extra medical requisitions, the transfer paperwork to the base hospital. A surgeon called down all the way from Fort Sam Houston for a single enemy prisoner, the books at her bedside, the roadside flowers, the way one female prisoner's file kept crossing his desk with Reed's careful signature at the bottom. One blistering morning in late May, Reed was summoned to the administration hut. Doyle did not offer a chair. "Corporal, do you know how many prisoners we hold in this camp?" Doyle asked. "More than 10,000, sir." "More than 10,000. Doyle let the number hang in the hot air. "And you found the time to arrange private surgery, a hospital transfer, and personal visits for exactly one of them. A German, a woman from a signals unit that passed the orders that helped kill American boys. She was wounded, sir. 4 months with metal against the bone. The Geneva Convention requires—" "Do not quote the convention to me." Doyle's voice stayed flat and quiet, which was far worse than shouting. "I have read the reports coming out of Germany, Corporal. I have seen the photographs of what they did in their camps. And meanwhile, you are carrying flowers to one of theirs." Reed said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. "There are rules about fraternization and reasons for those rules," Doyle continued. "You are a soldier of the United States Army. She is a prisoner of an enemy nation. That line does not bend because you feel sorry for her." "I treated a patient, sir," Reed said carefully, "not a nation. You will treat her as exactly what she is." For the first time, Doyle looked up from his desk. Here is what is going to happen. The war in Europe is over. Repatriation has already begun. Within months, every prisoner in this camp goes home across the ocean, and this whole circus ends. Until then, you will submit no requisition, no transfer, no request of any kind with that woman's name on it, unless I approve it personally. One more, Corporal, just one, and I will ship you to a supply depot in the Aleutian so fast that steel rod in your leg will rust before you land. Do we understand each other?" Reed understood perfectly. The clock was running now. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May. The camps were already emptying, and the one officer with the power to help Marguerite through what came next had just made himself Reed's enemy. It was not only Doyle. The mood of the whole country had shifted under their feet. The newsreels now showed the camps, the ditches, the survivors like skeletons behind wire, and every prisoner in Texas suddenly wore that horror on his back, whether he had earned it or not. Guards who had joked with the Germans in April stopped joking in May. "Why are we feeding them steak?" One soldier's mother wrote home, "When they starved our boys." The tide had turned against mercy at the exact moment Marguerite needed it most. Reed walked out of the administration hut into the sun with the distinct feeling that he had already lost, but he had not counted on an unexpected ally. The ally wore a major's leaves and had his hands in more blood than Doyle would ever see. Major Pritchard, the surgeon who had cut the fragment out of Marguerite's back, had operated across North Africa and Italy before Texas. He had held boys together on tables while the shells walked closer, run out of morphine and kept cutting anyway. Rank did not impress him, neither did clipboards. When Reed found him at the base hospital and told him about Doyle, the major listened without expression, cleaning his glasses on his sleeve. "He thinks healing the enemy is a waste of medicine," Pritchard said at last. It was not a question. "He thinks it's worse than a waste, sir. He thinks it's dangerous." Pritchard put his glasses back on. "I have taken metal out of 100 boys who died anyway. This one lived. You want to know what I think is dangerous corporal learning to decide who is worth saving based on the uniform they wore. That habit does not stay in the war. It follows a man home." Then the surgeon gave Reed something better than sympathy. He gave him an argument Doyle could not ignore. Texas that summer was desperate for hands. The men were still in uniform, and millions of acres of cotton were ripening with no one to pick them. The army had already begun sending German prisoners into the fields. But Doyle and officers like him saw a wounded prisoner as pure cost a mouth to feed a body that could not work a drain on a camp meant to earn its keep. "So we prove him wrong," Pritchard said. "We show him numbers. A prisoner we patch up and rehabilitate does not lie in a cot eating rations. He stands up. He works. He brings in the harvest this state cannot bring in without him. You want to protect that woman. Stop arguing that mercy is right. Doyle does not care about right. Prove that it pays." It was a cold way to defend a warm thing. Reed hated it a little, but he understood it. Doyle spoke the language of cost and waste of columns that had to balance. You could not beat him in the language of the heart. You had to beat him in his own tongue with a ledger and a number at the bottom of it, and that was exactly the weapon Pritchard was handing over. "And if it fails?" Reed asked. "Then I was wrong, you were wrong, and Doyle gets his transfer signed," Pritchard said. "I have wagered on worse odds with more lives on the table, Corporal. This is a fair bet. Take it or spend the rest of the war watching that woman get ground up by a filing cabinet." Reed took it. The plan was simple and brutal in its conditions. When the harvest opened in August, the medical section would put its rehabilitated prisoners into the fields alongside the healthy ones and keep records. If the patched-up prisoners carried their weight, the program lived, and Reed's judgment stood. If they collapsed in the rows, Doyle shut it all down and had his transfer. No second chance, no appeal. One harvest, one test, everyone watching. And it meant Marguerite 4 months out from a shell fragment, and only weeks from surgery, would have to reach overhead in 100-degree heat and pick cotton until dark. Reed brought her the news himself, through Gertrude, the older prisoner, who translated. Marguerite listened, then flexed the fingers of her right hand, slowly testing them, the way a person tests ice on a pond. "He is using me," she said quietly, "to win a fight with another officer." "Yes," Reed admitted, "I won't lie to you, but if it works, it protects you. All of you." She was silent a long moment. Then something hardened in her face, something that had survived a war and an ocean and a piece of steel next to her spine. "Then I will not fail in his field," she said. The morning of the harvest came, and if she faltered in front of Doyle, everything Reed had risked would collapse with her. They rolled out before dawn trucks grinding along dirt roads, while the sky went from black to bruised gray to a pale, merciless blue. The cotton stretched to the horizon, white bowls on brown stalks, acre after acre. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, the heat was already pressing down like a hand on the back of the neck. Doyle came too. He stood at the edge of the field in a pressed uniform with a clipboard of his own sunglasses hiding his eyes, a small, satisfied set to his mouth. 2 other officers stood with him. They had come to watch the medical section fail. Pritchard stood a little apart, saying nothing, a stopwatch in his palm like a man timing a race he had bet his career on. The prisoners climbed down and were handed long canvas sacks and a single word of instruction, spoken in English and mimed with hands. "Pick." Marguerite took her sack in her left hand. She looped the strap over her good shoulder, and she walked into her row. The first hour was almost mercy. The cotton near the top of the plants came easily, and her left hand flew, plucking the soft white from the dry brown husks. She kept her right arm close tucked, protecting it. Reed watched from the road and let himself breathe. Then the plants got shorter, the bolls got lower, and there was no more hiding the right arm. To reach the low cotton, she had to bend, twist and lift, and every lift pulled at the healing muscle across her shoulder blade. Reed saw the exact moment it found her. Her hand froze mid-reach. Her face went white beneath the dust. Her jaw locked the way it had that first day in the exam room, clamping down against a sound she refused to make. The half-full sack dragged in the red soil. Down the field, Doyle wrote something on his clipboard. He did not hurry. He had all day, and he knew it. The dry cotton bolls have sharp points, hooked like tiny claws, and they tore at fingers with every grab. Blood mixed with sweat on the prisoner's hands. The temperature climbed past 100. One older prisoner 2 rows over swayed and had to be walked to the water barrel. A guard called a break tin cups passed down the line, and the water was warm and tasted of metal and was the best thing any of them had ever drunk. Marguerite did not go to the water. She stood in her row, breathing in careful, shallow pulls, staring down at her own trembling right hand, as if it belonged to a stranger. Her sack lay in the dirt. Her shirt was soaked through and clinging. For a moment, she simply stood there swaying, and Reed's stomach dropped, because he knew that swaying. He had seen it in men about to go down. Down the field, one of Doyle's officers murmured something, and the captain's mouth curved. He lifted his pen. This was the moment he had driven out here at dawn to record. The wounded prisoner quitting in the heat, proving that patching up the enemy was a fool's charity after all. Reed took a step toward the field before he could stop himself. Every instinct he had, medic and man, both screamed at him to run out there and pull her into the shade. She saw him move, and she shook her head. Once. Sharp. Stay back. Her lips formed 2 words he could not hear across the rows, but he had learned to read her face by now, and he knew them anyway. Not here. Not in front of that man. She would fall in a ditch on the road home before she would fall in Doyle's field and hand him his victory. Then Margaret Hoffman did the thing that Reed would still be telling his grandchildren about 40 years later. She reached down with her right hand into the fire in her shoulder, past the pain that had ruled her body since January, and she picked the low cotton. Then she reached again. And again. She found a rhythm that used the healed arm without begging it, a slow, stubborn, deliberate motion, and she moved down the row and did not stop. The afternoon wore on, and still she did not stop. The rhythm cost her, and Reed could see it costing her in the set of her jaw. But the sack grew heavier by the hour, and every pound of cotton in it was a pound Doyle had said could not exist. By midday, she was not the fastest picker in the field. She did not need to be. She was simply still standing, still working her sack, growing heavier, her recently opened shoulder doing the exact labor Doyle had sworn it could never do. And she was not alone. All down the rows, the rehabilitated prisoners, the ones the medical section had patched and stitched and treated, were bent over the plants and working. Not one had collapsed and quit. The infection cases, the fracture cases, the ones written off as a drain on the camp, were bringing in cotton beside the healthy men's sack by dragging sack. When the trucks were weighed that evening, the numbers told a story Doyle could not argue with. The medical section's rehabilitated group had brought in nearly 90% of what the fully healthy prisoners managed on their very first day in the fields. The men written off as dead weight had produced almost as much as the strongest in the camp. Pritchard clicked his stopwatch shut, walked over to Doyle, and held out the tally sheet without a word. Doyle looked at the numbers for a long time. The satisfied set had gone out of his mouth. "One good day," he said finally. "One good day from people you swore couldn't stand," Pritchard answered. "Farmers across 3 counties are begging for hands, Captain. I can give them hundreds. Or you can shut me down and explain to the War Department why the cotton rotted in the field." Doyle did not have an answer for that. He turned and walked back to his car, and for the first time all summer, Reed watched the man leave a field without the last word. But winning one afternoon in a Texas cotton patch was one thing. What came next was something else entirely. Because the harvest was no longer a small experiment. The army leaned hard on prisoner labor across the country now, and the scale was staggering. By the end of that year, roughly 100,000 German prisoners of war were working American agriculture, picking fruit, cutting timber, harvesting the crops a nation at war could not bring in on its own. Camp Swift became a hub for it trucks rolling out at dawn, and back at dusk sacks weighed wages of a few cents a day recorded in canteen script. And the resistance did not vanish. It moved. Out on the farms, plenty of Americans did not want the enemy anywhere near their land. Families who had received the telegrams, the ones that began with the words, "The War Department regrets," did not care to see healthy young Germans working their fields and eating their food. Word of the death camps had hardened the whole country. Some farmers refused prisoner crews outright. Others took them and watched them like hawks waiting for sabotage. Reed found himself doing a new job now. He rode out to the farms with the medical crews, and he ended up explaining again and again to suspicious foremen and grieving farmers that a treated prisoner was a working prisoner, that a man with a healed hand picks more cotton than a man with a rotting one. On one farm, an old man with a hard, weathered face stopped Reed at the gate. His son had died in the Hurtgen forest the winter before. He looked at the German crew climbing down, and then at Reed. "You want me to feed them," the old man said. "Off my table." "I want you to bring in your cotton before it rots," Reed answered. "They'll work harder and cleaner than any crew you'll find this year, and they'll be gone by winter." The old man watched the prisoners a long moment. One of them, a boy no older than his son had been, was already reaching for a sack. "They took mine," the farmer said quietly. "I know," Reed said. "This won't give him back. But letting your field die won't either." The old man spat in the dust and said nothing, and let the crew through the gate. It was not forgiveness. It was something smaller and more stubborn than that, the plain fact that the cotton had to come in, and the dead did not care who picked it. Reed had learned to settle for that. He was no longer just a medic. He had become a translator between two kinds of hatred standing in the dust, arguing that keeping the enemy alive and whole was not softness, but sense. The strangest part was what happened out in the rows. Slowly, in 100 small ways, the propaganda began to die. American guards who had been told the Germans were monsters watched them share water and warn each other not to work too fast in the heat. German prisoners, who had been told the Americans would starve and beat them, found themselves handed cold water and 3 meals a day. One wrote home that he had eaten better as a captive in Texas than as a free man in the last winter of the Reich. The first successes spread faster than anyone expected. Farmers who had sworn they would never take a German crew came back the next week asking for more. The cotton came in. The harvest that everyone said would rot did not rot. Margaret worked through all of it, her shoulder growing stronger week by week. The arm that had once lifted only 2 inches before, the pain stopped it, now rose clean over her head to reach the high bowls. At each checkup, Reed marked her progress and watched a person come back to life. She began to hum again, old songs from before the war, folding laundry in the steam of the wash house. One of the other women said it was as if a weight had been cut out of her mind at the same time it was cut out of her back. For a few short weeks that autumn, in the strangest of places, something like peace settled over the wire. It could not last. From a hidden wound and a suspicious captain, Reed had built something almost impossible, a working order where the enemy was healed instead of hated, and it had proven itself under a 100-degree sun. The numbers had won. The cotton was in. Even Doyle had run out of arguments. But the war was not finished with them yet, because the cooler air of autumn carried new orders from above. The great machine of repatriation was turning faster now, and it did not care about Texas cotton fields or the fragile understanding built in them. The lists were being drawn up. Names were being typed onto transport manifests. Ships were being readied on the eastern coast to carry the prisoners back across the Atlantic, back to a Germany in ruins, a country of blackened walls and hungry cities, and an uncertain future under foreign occupation. Margaret's name would be on one of those lists. So soon would Reed's discharge papers. And there was still the vial. the twisted chip of German steel sealed in 3 inches of glass, waiting on a shelf for someone to decide what it meant. In Part 3, the goodbyes arrive. The ocean opens between them, and a single act of mercy faces its hardest test of all, whether anything human can survive the peace that follows total war. By the winter of 1945, a German prisoner named Marguerite Hoffmann had survived what should have killed her, a shell fragment hidden for 4 months, a secret surgery in a Texas camp, and an American medic, Corporal Thomas Reed, who had risked his own career to save an enemy's life, then fought a stubborn captain and an entire cotton harvest to prove that mercy could pay its own way. She had healed. She had learned that almost everything she was told about the enemy was a lie. Then the orders came down. The war in Europe was over, and the great machine of repatriation had begun to turn. More than 370,000 German prisoners were being shipped out of the United States, back across the Atlantic, back to a homeland that no longer existed the way they remembered it. Allied bombers had dropped over 1.5 million tons of explosives on Germany. Whole cities were simply gone. Millions of people were homeless, and every prisoner on those transport lists was going home to the ruins. Margaret's name was on one of them. Think about the size of what was ending. For nearly 2 years, German prisoners had been scattered across more than 500 camps in 45 American states. They had picked cotton in Texas and cut timber in the Midwest and canned fish on the coasts. Some had learned English. A few had fallen in love with the country that held them. Now, in a matter of months, an entire captive nation was being pulled up by the roots and sent back across 3,000 miles of ocean to whatever was left. And now, this was no longer a story about one wound in Texas. It was about whether anything 2 enemies had learned could survive the crossing home. It was February 1946 when the notice reached the women's barracks. A transport was leaving. Roughly 300 prisoners from Camp Swift were on the manifest, and Marguerite was among them. The camp that had been their strange home for almost a year was turning back into an ordinary army post, emptying barracks by barracks, name by name. Across the country, the same thing was happening at scale. In the space of a few months, hundreds of thousands of men and women who had come to America as the soldiers of a conquering empire were being loaded onto trains and ships and sent back the way they had come. They had arrived expecting to rule Europe for 1,000 years. They were leaving as passengers on someone else's timetable, and they were not leaving the way they had come. The men who had marched off the boats in 1943, hard-eyed and certain sure that Germany would win and the world would be theirs, were not the men climbing back aboard now. 2 years in America had shown them full grocery shelves in a country their leaders had told them was on its knees. It had shown them factories no bombing raid had ever touched. Many of them had figured out slowly in a cotton field or a canning line that they had been lied to about nearly everything. They were going home carrying that knowledge like a stone in the chest. The morning she left was cold and thin. The women lined up at the gate with small bundles, a change of clothes, a few letters, maybe a photograph, maybe a Bible. The mess hall smelled of oatmeal and coffee. Trucks idled by the wire engines ticking in the chill. Reed met her near the infirmary. He was being discharged himself within weeks, sent home to Chicago, and a civilian life he could barely picture anymore. He held something small in his hand. It was the vial. Inside the 3 inches of glass floated the twisted chip of German steel that had ridden in her shoulder across a village, a country, and an ocean. The surgeon had kept it on a shelf. Reed had asked for it back. "I thought you should have it," he said. She turned the glass between her fingers. It was cold and clean. The metal that had tried to kill her for 4 months looked almost harmless, now trapped and small. "What will I do with such a thing?" she asked. "Whatever you like," he answered. "Keep it. Throw it in the sea. It's your story now." She slipped it into her bag next to her papers. "I will keep it on my desk one day," she said quietly, "to remember that an enemy's knife saved me from my own army's shell." There was a great deal neither of them said. There was no language for it, and no time, and a supervisor was watching. He could not tell her to write. She could not tell him what a year of his stubbornness had meant. They had met as captor and captive on opposite sides of the worst war in human history, and somewhere between the exam room and the cotton field that had stopped being the truest thing about them, they shook hands. It was a brief, correct gesture, watched by a supervisor a few steps away. But both of them felt the weight of everything it stood in for. A year of arguments and surgeries and cotton fields and small mercies folded down into a single handshake at a gate. Then she climbed into the truck. The engine roared. Dust rose. Camp Swift began to shrink behind her and Corporal Thomas Reed with it until both were gone. She would not see him again for 6 long years. She would never set foot in Texas again at all. But leaving Texas was only the first ocean she had to cross. The journey home reversed the one that had brought her. Trucks to trains. Trains rolling east across a country she had once crossed as a terrified captive, and now crossed as something harder to name. Then the coast. Then the ships. By 1946, the same Liberty ships that had carried prisoners west were carrying them back east, more than 2,000 souls at a time. The crossing took nearly 2 weeks. The sea was gray and heavy. The hold smelled of oil and salt, and too many bodies pressed together in the dark. But this time, the fear was different. On the way over, they had feared the enemy. Now they feared home, because word had reached the camps of what waited across the water. Germany was broken. Rumors ran through the bunks of hunger of families scattered to the wind, of whole cities reduced to fields of brick and standing chimneys. Nearly a fifth of all German homes had been destroyed. Millions of displaced people were drifting across the country's ruins with nowhere to go. Prisoners who had dreamed for years of going home now lay awake wondering if there was any home left to return to. One man said aloud what many were thinking. "We survived the war. I am not certain we will survive the peace." He was not being dramatic. The winter after the war was one of the cruelest in living memory. Coal was short. Food was shorter. In the shattered cities, people were living in cellars and boiling nettles for soup. The occupying armies had divided the country into 4 zones, and no one on that ship knew which zone their hometown had fallen into, or what that would mean for the years ahead. Margaret lay in her bunk with the vial in her hand, running her thumb over the cold glass. She thought of her father in Heidelberg. Was he alive? Was the house still standing? Was the university she had left a lifetime ago even there anymore? Every mile of gray water carried her closer to answers she was terrified to hear. She had learned in Texas that the enemy could be kind. Now she had to learn whether her own shattered country could still be lived in at all. The ship docked in a European port that itself lay half in ruins. The train started again, and as the countryside rolled past the windows, the war revealed itself mile by mile. Rail yards twisted into scrap iron, bridges lying broken in their rivers, factories reduced to skeletons of black girder. Towns she remembered as neat and whole now stood open to the sky walls without roofs, staircases climbing up into nothing. The people were the worst of it. Children picked through rubble beside the tracks. Old women sold buttons and shoelaces from trays. Men in the remains of army coats stood at the stations with cardboard signs looking for wives, for sons, for anyone. This was the 1,000-year empire now. This was what the slogans had built. Marguerite pressed her face to the cold glass and understood for the first time completely the size of what her country had done and what had been done to it in return. Then the train reached her city, and what she saw stopped her cold. Heidelberg was standing. While the rest of Germany lay in ruins, her city had been spared. The Americans had not bombed it. Cologne was a wasteland. Hamburg had burned in a firestorm. Dresden was ash. But Heidelberg still climbed its green hills above the river, the old castle still glowing red against the slope, the narrow streets still there, the rooftops still whole. For a moment she could not breathe. After a year of imagining ruins, she was looking at home almost untouched. Then she saw the river. The bridges were gone. In the last days of March 1945, the retreating German army had dynamited every crossing over the Neckar. The famous old bridge, The one that had stood for nearly 2 centuries, the one painted in 1,000 pictures of the city, lay broken in the water. Its arches were snapped. Its twin towers stood at the edge of a gap that dropped straight into the river. That was the whole war in a single image. A city spared by the enemy and its own soldiers, blowing up its most beautiful bridge on their way out the door. The Americans had left Heidelberg standing. Germany had wrecked its own heart on the way down. She walked up from the station. Her legs shook. The streets were the same streets she had walked as a student, past the same shop fronts, under the same castle on the hill. But everything felt thinner now, quieter, as if the whole city were holding its breath. American jeeps rattled over the cobblestones. Signs in English had appeared on old German buildings. She did not know what she would find at the top of the street. Her father was alive. He was thinner, grayer. His hands trembled when he took her face in them. But he was alive, and he was standing in the doorway of a house that still had its roof, and for a long moment neither of them could speak at all. She had left him a soldier's daughter, marching off to serve the Reich. She had come back to him, a survivor of the enemy's mercy, and neither of them was the same person who had said goodbye. Then he saw the way she held her right arm. Freer now. Almost normal. "Your shoulder," he said. "It is healed, Papa," she told him. An American took the metal out. He stared at her. A chemist. A man of the old Germany who had been taught the same lies as everyone else about the savages across the ocean. "An American," he repeated. "An American," she said. "He gave me this." And she showed him the vial. Her father held the little bottle up to the window light, turning it the way a chemist turns anything. He does not understand, looking for the logic in it. The dark chip of metal drifted in its clear fluid. "They took it out," he said slowly, "and then they gave it back to you." "They gave me everything back, Papa," she said. "My arm, my life, the truth about who they were." He was quiet a long time. He had spent years being told these people were animals. Now his daughter stood in front of him whole because one of them had refused to let her die. Something in the old man's face shifted the same way something had shifted in hers, in a Texas supply room, less like a wall, more like a door. The city her father lived in was quiet and strange under occupation. American jeeps rolled through the old streets. American soldiers stood on corners where German ones had stood a year before. And in the middle of it all, something remarkable was happening. The university was reopening. Heidelberg had been founded in the 14th century, one of the oldest universities in the German-speaking world, and now the American military government had chosen it to be among the very first they allowed to open its doors again. In the winter of 1945 and into 1946, lecture halls that had been silenced began to fill. The occupiers wanted a new Germany, built on learning instead of marching, and they were starting here in the one great city the bombs had left whole. It was slow, careful work. The Americans screened the faculty, removing the men who had served the old regime, too eagerly keeping the ones who could teach a generation something better. Textbooks were scarce. Heating was scarcer. Students showed up in patched coats and worn boots. Some of them ex-soldiers themselves, sitting in cold rooms because sitting in a classroom felt like proof that the future still existed. Out of the rubble of the worst thing Germany had ever done, someone was trying to build a place that made healers instead of weapons. Her father, a chemist, was already working with the American officials to help reopen the chemistry department, and he wanted his daughter back in it. For weeks, Marguerite hesitated. She had left as a girl who tapped out radio codes for an army that no longer existed. She had crossed an ocean twice. She carried a scar on her shoulder and a chip of steel in a bottle. She did not know if she could sit in a lecture hall and pretend to be young again. Then one night, she took the vial down from the shelf where she had set it, and she turned it over in her hand. She thought of the field station in Germany, where men had screamed all night with no morphine. She thought of the cool, clean cabinet in Texas, the rows of glass ampoules, the weight of a full bottle in her palm. She thought of the surgeon in his green gown holding up this very chip of metal. And she understood exactly what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. She would make medicine. She wrote it to read later in a letter that crossed the same ocean the fragment had. It seemed right that I should work on medicines, she told him. After all, I am only alive because someone had enough medicine to spare a little of it for a prisoner. She enrolled. The chemistry department took her back. And in a country that had spent 6 years learning how to destroy a woman with a scar on her shoulder, sat down at a laboratory bench to learn how to heal. And news of what was rising out of the ruins of Germany would soon travel farther than she could imagine. Because the country that lay flat in 1946 did not stay flat. What happened next was one of the strangest reversals of the century. The same medicine that had crossed the Atlantic on Allied ships, the penicillin and the sulfa drugs that had saved Marguerite's life in a Texas hospital, began to flow the other way. West German factories rebuilt from rubble with American money started producing antibiotics by the millions of doses. By the early 1950s, the country that had run out of clean bandages at the end of the war was manufacturing the very drugs it had once been unable to give its own wounded. The change was almost too large to see from the inside. A nation that had built rockets and tanks and death camps turned its factories to penicillin, to fertilizer, to the ordinary machinery of keeping people alive. Within a decade, West Germany would have one of the strongest economies in the world, its recovery so rapid that people would call it a miracle. But it was not a miracle. It was thousands of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people to build instead of burn. Marguerite was one of them, and her decision had begun in a Texas cabinet full of glass ampules. American aid poured in. The Marshall Plan alone sent roughly $13 billion into a broken Europe, and a great share of it went into rebuilding German industry, German cities, German laboratories. The old enemies were becoming something no one in 1945 would have believed. Partners. Marguerite lived inside that reversal. She finished her studies. She took her place at a laboratory bench in the New Germany in a white coat with a scar on her shoulder and a small glass vial standing on her desk. Year by year, she helped make the kind of medicine that had once been handed to her as an act of mercy by a man she had been taught to hate. In 1952, she sent Reed a photograph. It showed her standing outside a rebuilt university building, a degree in her hand, squinting into the sun. Her note was short. Dear Thomas, I thought you would want to know that I finished. I still have the fragment. It reminds me that very small pieces of metal and very small mercies can change the direction of an entire life. Reed read it behind the counter of a pharmacy in Chicago. He had left the army married and gone into the family trade filling prescriptions in a shop that smelled of chalk and alcohol and paper. He had traded his rifle for a rod in his leg and his medic's kit for a druggist's scale. He was in his own quiet way doing the same thing she was standing behind a counter, handing people the small mercies that keep a life going. He showed the photograph to his wife, and then he put the letter carefully into a box with the others. Over the years, that box would fill. A photo of a rebuilt lecture hall. A note about a new job. A line now and then about the fragment still sitting on her desk. Two people who had met on opposite sides of a war, keeping a thin thread alive across an ocean, one letter at a time. Two people. Two countries. One ocean between them. And a war that had tried and failed to make them hate each other for the rest of their lives. It is worth stopping on how unlikely that was. Everything had been arranged to keep these two apart forever. The propaganda, the uniforms, the camps, the oceans, the politics of victor and vanquished. By every rule of the century, they lived in Marguerite Hoffman, and Thomas Reed should have died as strangers, who each believed the other was a monster. Instead, they wrote letters. Instead, they kept each other's small tokens on their shelves. The war had spent 6 years and tens of millions of lives trying to teach them to hate, and a single afternoon in an exam room had undone it. From a hidden wound in a Texas camp to a laboratory in the New Germany, the story had come full circle. The prisoner had become a healer. The enemy's medicine had become her life's work. The medal that was meant to kill her sat on her desk as a reminder that mercy once given does not stop moving. But every story like this comes in the end to a quieter question. What happens to it when the people who lived it grow old? When Marguerite Hoffman is an old woman with white hair and a scar, no one asks about anymore. When Thomas Reed is gone, and the letters sit in a box, and the vial gathers dust on a desk far from Texas. Because this story has one last chapter. It is the smallest chapter, and the quietest, and almost no one knows it. And it is the one that decides whether any of it will be remembered at all. In Part 4, the final chapter, we follow the fragment to its last resting place and discover what a single act of mercy between two enemies leaves behind, when everything else, the war, the camps, the armies, and even the people themselves, has finally faded away. Over 3 parts, we have followed one of the strangest true stories of the Second World War. A German prisoner named Marguerite Hoffmann, who hid a shell fragment in her shoulder for 4 months, because she trusted the enemy less than she trusted the metal that was killing her. An American medic, Corporal Thomas Reed, who refused to let her die, who opened a cabinet of medicine to win her trust, and who fought a stubborn captain, and an entire cotton harvest to prove that mercy had a place even inside a prison camp. She healed. She went home to a ruined Germany. She built a life making the very medicine that had saved her. But at the end of Part 3, we left you with a question. What happens to a story like this when the people who lived it grow old and die? Because this final chapter holds a quiet twist that almost no one knows. And it turns out that the smallest thing in this entire story, a chip of metal the size of a fingernail, would outlast the armies, the camps, and even the 2 people themselves. Because sometimes the price of surviving a war is learning how to live in the peace that follows. And sometimes what a single life leaves behind is smaller and stronger than anyone expects. The years after the war were kind to Marguerite Hoffmann in the way that matters most. They were ordinary. She finished her degree at Heidelberg. She married. She had a daughter. She spent her working life at a laboratory bench in the new West Germany, in a white coat, helping to make the antibiotics that a single generation earlier had been unimaginable luxuries, the drugs that had once seemed to a starving field hospital like something out of a fairy tale. She grew from the frightened young prisoner of a Texas camp into a quiet, respected woman of science, the kind of person who never raised her voice and never needed to. She did not become famous. There were no medals for what she had lived through, no ceremonies, no articles in the newspaper. History does not usually hand out honors to a captured enemy radio clerk who happened to survive. And she never asked for any. Her revenge on the war that had tried to kill her was simply to spend the rest of her life making the medicine that keeps other people alive. It was, she felt, the only reply worth giving. She raised her daughter. She went to her laboratory. She came home in the evenings, and year after ordinary year, she quietly built the future that the shell at Remagen had nearly taken from her. And on her desk, for all of those decades, stood a small glass vial with a dark chip of metal inside. Colleagues asked about it sometimes. She would smile and say only that it was a long story. A few of them got the whole thing told softly over a cup of coffee: the shell at Remagen, the hidden wound, the cabinet of medicine, the American who would not take no for an answer. Most just saw an odd little bottle on the desk of a kind old chemist and never once guessed what it had cost her or what it had given her. 6 years after they parted at the camp gate, she and Reed saw each other one final time. In 1952, Reed crossed the Atlantic again, not as a soldier this time, but as an ordinary traveler who had saved for the trip, and the 2 of them walked together along the Neckar in Heidelberg. By then, the old bridge had been rebuilt stone by careful stone, standing again over the water as though it had never been broken at all. They were both older now. He walked with a limp from the leg that had kept him out of the war and sent him to Texas in the first place. She carried a scar beneath her coat that he had once laid 2 fingers against through a thin cotton shirt. They did not say a great deal. They did not need to. 2 people who had met as enemies stood together on a rebuilt bridge in a rebuilt country, and that in the end was the whole conversation. Then Reed went home to Chicago and grew old behind his pharmacy counter. The young man who had trained to fire a rifle, who had wanted so badly to fight in Europe, spent the rest of his days doing the opposite of what the army had prepared him for. He measured out powders. He counted pills. He handed ordinary people the small mercies that keep an ordinary life going. A cough remedy, a bottle for a sick child, a word of reassurance across the counter. It was the same work he had done in that Texas exam room, only without the wire and the guards. He raised his family, and he told the story to his children, and then to his grandchildren, always in the same way. When you hear about the war, he would say, remember not only the tanks and the bombs, remember also a woman with metal in her shoulder, and how we learned that the enemy was not always who we thought. Some of the children believed him. Some thought it was just an old man's tale. He did not mind either way. He knew it had happened. He had held the fragment in his own hand while it was still warm from her body. Margaret lived into her 80s. When she died, the vial was still standing on her desk exactly where she had promised 40 years before at a gate in Texas that she would keep it. But the real legacy of what happened in that camp was not written in any letter, and it was not sealed inside any bottle. It was written into the future of 2 entire nations. Think about the numbers one more time. More than 370,000 German prisoners passed through the American camps during the war, and nearly all of them eventually went home. And most of them went home having discovered the way Marguerite did that almost everything they had been told about America was false. They had been promised savages, and instead, they had found people who fed them, healed their wounds, and let them live to go home again. That mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because those hundreds of thousands of returning men and women became without meaning to a quiet army of witnesses. They went back to their shattered towns and villages, and over the kitchen tables of a defeated nation, told the truth about the enemy, that the Americans had not starved them, that the Americans had operated on their wounded, that the country they had been taught to hate had treated them in the end with something close to decency. You cannot bomb that kind of testimony into a country, and you cannot force it at the point of a gun. It can only be earned one prisoner at a time, one act of decency at a time. Every canteen of water handed to a frightened man in a cellar, every wound cleaned, every meal served, was a small deposit in an account that would not be drawn on for years. When the time came to rebuild the peace, that account was full, and the men who had filled it were the ordinary soldiers and medics and clerks who had simply chosen not to be cruel when cruelty would have cost them nothing. Historians who study the post-war years have pointed to that experience as one of the quiet reasons the reconciliation between Germany and the United States came as fast and as deep as it did. It is worth pausing on how astonishing that reconciliation was. These were countries that had fought each other in 2 world wars in the space of a single lifetime. Their soldiers had killed one another across the fields of France and the forests of the Ardennes. Their cities had been bombed to rubble by the other side. By every logic of history, the hatred between them should have lasted for generations. Instead, within 10 years of the war's end, West Germany was not an enemy at all, but an ally, a member of the Western Alliance, a partner rebuilt with American money and defended by American soldiers. The nations that had killed each other by the millions became in less than a generation 2 of the closest friends in the modern world, and they have stayed that way for over 70 years. Old soldiers who had once shot at each other would meet on the battlefields where they had fought, shake hands, and lay wreaths together. It was one of the great acts of forgiveness in modern history, and it did not happen only in treaties and summits. It happened in hundreds of thousands of small human encounters, in camps and hospitals and cotton fields, exactly like the one between a medic and a prisoner in Texas. And the medicine flowed both ways forever after. The penicillin and sulfa drugs that had crossed the ocean on Allied ships to save a prisoner in a Texas hospital were within a decade being manufactured by the ton in German laboratories, in factories where women like Marguerite stood at the benches. The knowledge that had once been a weapon of the victors became a shared inheritance of both peoples. Today, an American and a German can be treated in the same hospital with the same drugs developed by scientists who no longer think of each other as anything but colleagues. Somewhere in that vast, invisible exchange of healing was one small contribution made by a woman who was only alive to make it because an enemy had chosen to save her. She would never be able to measure how many people her work touched. Neither can we. But every dose of medicine she helped bring into the world was in a sense a debt being repaid, mercy given to her in a Texas cabinet, passed forward to strangers she would never meet. But the biggest lesson in all of it was never really about medicine or politics or the fate of nations at all. It was about how easily human beings can be taught to hate, and how quickly that teaching can come undone. Consider how much force had been spent to keep Marguerite and Reed apart. Years of propaganda on both sides, newsreels and leaflets and speeches, uniforms, borders, prison wire, an entire ocean. 2 governments and 2 war machines had worked to convince each of them that the other was a monster. And all of that effort, all of those millions of words and images, was undone in a single afternoon by one medic who laid his hand on a wounded woman's shoulder and decided to treat a patient instead of an enemy. That is the thing worth remembering. Hatred between peoples is not natural. It has to be manufactured deliberately at enormous cost, and it survives only as long as the 2 sides never actually meet as human beings. The moment they do, the whole structure can collapse. It happened on the Western Front on Christmas of 1914, when British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, exchanged gifts, and played football in no man's land before their officers ordered them to start killing again. It has happened in 1,000 smaller moments, in every war ever fought, an enemy soldier lowering his rifle, a captor sharing his rations, a nurse treating a wounded man from the other side. We tell ourselves that history is made by the big forces, the armies, the ideologies, the leaders shouting from balconies. But it is also made, and sometimes unmade, in these small rooms by ordinary people who choose against everything they have been told to see the person in front of them clearly. And this is not just a lesson about a war that ended 80 years ago. The same machinery is still running today. We are still told constantly that the people on the other side of some line, another country, another party, another faith, are not quite human, that they are the enemy, that they cannot be reasoned with. The propaganda is slicker now, delivered through screens instead of leaflets, but it works the same way it always has. It depends absolutely on us never actually meeting the people we are taught to fear. Marguerite and Reed are proof of what happens when we do. The story is old, but the warning inside it is not. It is aimed directly at us. There is one more thing worth saying about Reed himself. He was not a saint. He was a bored young corporal doing paperwork he resented, in a job he had never wanted, in a place he had never chosen. He was not looking to change history or make a grand moral statement. He simply refused one hot afternoon to write "no injury" on a form when he could feel the heat of an infection burning through a woman's shirt. That is the humbling part. Courage of this kind does not usually look like courage. It looks like an ordinary person doing the next right thing when it would have been so much easier and so much safer to look away. And there is one last detail in this story that almost no one knows. When Marguerite Hoffman died, her daughter was left to sort through a lifetime of papers. And there, among the ordinary things, she found 2 treasures. She found a bundle of letters written in English in a careful American hand spanning decades. And she found the small glass vial with its dark chip of metal still sitting where it had always sat. The daughter had grown up with that little bottle on her mother's desk, a familiar, unexplained object of her childhood. Only now, reading the letters, did she understand the full weight of what it was. She could have kept them in a drawer. She could have let the whole story quietly disappear, the way almost every such story does, folded away into a box in an attic, until no one alive remembered what it meant. Instead, she carried the vial and the letters to a small museum in Heidelberg, one that collected not the tanks and the medals, but the everyday objects of the war, and the long recovery that followed the ration cards, the photographs, the small human things that the big history books leave out. And then something happened that closed the circle completely. Word of the donation reached the family of Thomas Reed back in Chicago, where he too had by now passed away. Going through his belongings, they had found a box of their own, half a century of Marguerite's letters, kept as carefully as she had kept his. And so, from across the same ocean, the fragment had first crossed in a prisoner's shoulder. Reed's half of the correspondence was sent to Heidelberg to join hers. It turns out that the 2 halves of a friendship that had lived its whole life apart one voice in Germany, and one in America. One letter crossing the water at a time finally came to rest together in a single glass case. Everything they had ever written to each other side by side at last. Today, the fragment still sits in that case. The tag beneath it is very simple. Shell fragment removed from German prisoner Texas, 1945. It does not even give their names. Most visitors walk straight past it. They are drawn to the bigger displays, the uniforms and the maps and the photographs of ruined streets. But now and then, someone stops. They lean close to the little chip of metal in its glass. And if they read the letters beside it, they learn the story you now know of a hidden wound. An American who would not accept a lie and a choice to trust that went against everything two enemies had ever been taught. So let us gather the whole of it into a few final words. From a signals clerk with a piece of steel in her back and a limping medic who was never even supposed to fight, came one of the quietest and most human stories the Second World War ever produced. They never won a battle. They never changed a border. They never appeared in the headlines, and they were never written into the great history books that line the shelves. But between the two of them, in a hot Texas camp, they proved that even in the middle of total war, an act of mercy between enemies could outlast the flags, the slogans, and the guns. More than 370,000 prisoners went home from those American camps, carrying a changed picture of the enemy, and the peace they helped make has now lasted more than 70 years. That is what one afternoon, one cabinet of medicine, one refusal to look away can grow into. Not a battle won or a city taken, but something rarer and more lasting. The slow, stubborn discovery that the person you were taught to hate can turn out to be worth saving. Because in a century that measured its power in tanks and bombs and the size of its armies, the most powerful thing anyone in this story ever did was smaller than a bullet. One person chose to see another human being clearly. And that single choice is still sitting in a glass case in Heidelberg today, quietly outlasting the entire war that was built to make it impossible.